Hey guys, for any of you who happen to find this video, I just wanted to riff on something that I've been thinking about periodically over the last few years as I've been pulling back more from like outright political activism. Um, I know it doesn't look like it because every video on this channel is political activism, everything on my Medium blog, everything on my Substack so far. Um, But, there's something that keeps sparking off in my mind about the course of human history not being this straight line the way that we are taught that it is. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because I think a lot of us on the left, and I think probably a lot of people that are on the more conservative end of the political spectrum, have both been leaning into the idea that we need a revolution in this country. Like, it's the logical next thing to extrapolate, right? Once you see that the whole entire system is a failure, that it's not either political party specifically, it's not one individual, it's not just Trump, it's not just Biden, it's actually the whole entire system is like rotten through the core, right? Like stage 4 cancer. And then also observing that elections don't work. Like, elections really have changed nothing, right? Unfortunately, the majority of normie Americans keep running right back to the two-party machine over and over again, no matter what you tell them. And a lot of times, if anybody gets disaffected enough, the most they'll do is run to the other party. Like, we saw that in the last two elections. There were Republicans that voted red all the way down the ticket, but they voted for Joe Biden as the president in 2020. And then just the opposite thing happened in 2024. So it's out of the frying pan into the fire. And I think the easiest conclusion to draw is that we need an actual revolution. And I have certainly been a proponent of that thinking for quite a long time. I said it a lot on my social media, particularly during the Bernie Sanders days. I mean, Bernie's whole thing he was promoting was a political revolution, right? And we really felt like we had one. He had galvanized such a huge movement behind him. America loves to, well, I don't like saying America because America is like three different continents, but the United States and Americans love to kind of memory hole how big of a movement he really had. But just as a reminder, Bernie Sanders out fundraised every single Democrat combined on the 2020 primary ticket every single quarter during the primary election. And he did the same thing in 2016. All of it was from small donors. When he signed up again to run for president in 2020, he had over 1 million volunteers on the ground signed up through his campaign the same day that he announced. And there's been no movement behind a political candidate that big in the last 100 years. Not behind Trump, not behind RFK Jr., not behind anybody. So there were a lot of people that were galvanized behind the idea that the combination of a top down change agent holding presidential office and a mobilized grassroots would be able to create this sandwich effect, right? That would put constant pressure on all of the institutions that have been wielding power in this country, political institutions and corporate institutions, both, in order to affect the changes that would get Bernie Sanders' policies done, right? And then when Bernie Sanders, just abandoned his own project again, um, there was a split where a lot of people just ran right back into the Democratic Party as usual, which was frustrating. And then a lot of us were just like, no, I'm just done with the whole electoral project unless it's third parties, period. Um, and we need a revolution. And unless there's a revolution, nothing's going to change. But here's where I'm going with this. Okay. This has sparked off, especially this week. I mean, I think about it a lot. I just don't talk about it a lot. It's not something that I've put out on my media, but it is something that I've been contemplating and observing for actually quite some time now. I want to refer you to a video, and I can drop the link. Well, I can drop both links in the description, but there's a really good channel here on YouTube called After School, SKOOL. And they do really cool whiteboard animations in collaboration with different creators. And this one that they just dropped a few minutes ago was with a creator called Medieval Mindset. And he talks about how the times that we think are so unprecedented right now, if you fit them into the larger historical context, they're really not unprecedented at all. And I don't want to spoil that video for you. It's only like 12 minutes or something. I would just recommend watching it. But he points out a lot of the kind of fallacies in our thinking when we start getting as fatalistic as we do about the current times that we're living in, right? And kind of assuming that this apocalypse is upon us. But there is another angle to this. Well, there's a couple other angles I want to touch on, but I want to make this video, I mean, my last video was so long. I want to make this shorter. So in my last video toward the end, after reading a bunch of stuff from one of Chris Hedges' books, I started talking about documentaries I've seen about the Roman Empire. I've had kind of a fascination with the Roman Empire for a long time. And there is a documentary series from the 1990s called Rome, the Power and the Glory. And it's 6 parts, I think. I think it's 6 parts. You can still find it up on YouTube. I've watched it a number of times. And I really appreciate the way they put that documentary together because the episodes are organized in terms of the timeline of the empire based on the rise, the consolidation of power, the expansion, and so forth. So you can kind of like really clearly see the trajectory play out. And then they have the episode about the fall of the empire, right? And this guy in After School pointed this out. He just made a passing remark about it in this video today, but it's something that is highlighted if you really study the fall of the Roman Empire. And I remember the first time I watched that documentary, it really pinged with me, and I found this this spark of hope that maybe it doesn't actually take a revolution. What if we don't need a revolution? Because I mean, and I sound like I'm contradicting everything I've ever said in the past because I have 100% been on board with revolution, and I have been very vocal about that, like a whole lot of times, you know. Um, I have. It is true, but the part of me that hopes for a better world that works for all of us with a kinder society that respects all life and would rather not see um, the level of violence and chaos and disruption that goes with revolutions, has always hoped that there would be some other type of shift that takes place. And I don't mean the kind of shift that liberals advocate with their harm reduction policies, like you just have to keep voting for the Democrat because the other side is worse and we have to nibble around the edges and just do the best we can, for decades and hope that if we just elect enough progressives, we'll pull the party left. I don't mean that kind of a thing at all. I mean a different type of shift that happens. And when I look at the way that the Roman Empire fell, at least my understanding of it, the way this guy in After School put it today, he just said it very succinctly that Rome went from being a bloated, centralized bureaucracy that could no longer manage itself or any of its conquered territories into a whole bunch of small localized communities that were self-organized, right? And that was how the transition slowly happened into medieval Europe. And we could argue that organizing into medieval fiefdoms and the feudal system wasn't great either, but also capitalism is a feudal system. That's not really where I see the possibility. Where I see what changes my thinking. Okay. So in the fall of The fall of Rome is hotly contested as far as like what date it happened, because it didn't just happen overnight or in a single week, right? Like we tend to think that empires just kind of like they're there and then they're not. And that's not what happened. There was a slow decline. There were multiple times from about 300 AD onward where the various barbarian tribes encroached upon the Mediterranean borders of Rome, went in, sacked the city, overthrew the emperor, and people thought it was all over. Several different times, including there was the really famous sack of Rome that people are most familiar with in 410 AD, when the Visigoth, no, was he the, I can't remember the names of the tribes. Gothic, there were the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, and then there was also something else. Anyway, this general named Alaric, that the Romans had labeled barbarian, had come south asking the emperor on multiple occasions for some land for his people. They offered to pay fair prices for the land. They really just wanted to be part of the society. And this, I think, is also kind of, there are so many lessons we could mine from this about American imperialism and the way that we view refugees and immigrants. I'm not going to litigate that in this video, but it's notable that the Romans called everybody from their conquered territories barbarians. But really, the Mediterranean was where it was at. Everybody wanted a piece of life in the Mediterranean because the climate was friendly, the soil was fertile, life was good. So most of these conquered tribes had been living as Romans for generations. They were highly educated, they spoke Latin, they had served in the Roman armies, and they just wanted their piece of the benefits of the empire that had conquered them. The same way the American poor and working classes want now. We just want our piece of the American dream, right? And Alaric had asked the emperor multiple times um, for an equitable deal for his people, and the emperor basically spat on them, called them barbarians, he mocked them, the same way the American government does to us now. And Alaric got fed up, and he brought 40,000 of his troops right outside the city gates. The emperor still said no, and they sacked the city of Rome, right? Completely burned it all down. And yet, the empire still staggered along for like another 60 years. So even then, it wasn't completely over. And even then, this is the other interesting thing, it did not spark a revolution, right? Every single time things get bad, it seems like the people would rise up and revolt. Like that's the whole American imperial project. It's like the American government sends its CIA and its alphabet agencies and its military and its secret troops into these different countries, and it foments color revolutions, or it institutes economic sanctions in order to immiserate the population, or purposely commits all sorts of devastation against the population, like what the government is doing in Iran right now. And the agenda is to cause the people to become so unhappy that they overthrow their own government and basically like do the work for the American empire. Um, and, so it's like, but I don't know how often that has actually worked, because even with all of these sacks of Rome across the end of the Roman Empire timeline, the Roman citizens didn't rise up and revolt against the Senate or revolt against the emperor. I mean, not really, right? What did happen though was 60 years later, there was another general of another tribe, and all these tribes had been consistently encroaching on the borders because the Mongolian invasions were running everybody out of their territory, right? They were running everybody out of Gaul, which was Germany, France, and England, and pushing people south just to survive with Genghis Khan and his son Kublai Khan. Um, and But these people were kind of encroaching closer and closer into the Mediterranean, and they were more and more often making independent land deals. right? So the Roman military wasn't able to feed or pay its troops anymore. The currency had been inflated to such an extreme that the Roman drachma, I think it was called the maybe not. No, that's the German currency. Forget it. It doesn't matter what the currency is called, but the Roman currency had no value. The troops were consistently not getting paid. They were kept for 10, 20 years overseas where they were losing everything and their families were moving on without them, or, way out in these territories that nobody wanted to live in, like way up north. And so what they started to do was they started to make their own deals with these barbarian tribes. They started to intermarry with them. They started to work out land deals. They started to sell property. They started to do trade. They started to form alliances all over these different border territories and get further and further away from the centralized government of Rome. This was the formation of local economies. And these local economies started to happen all over the Western Roman Empire, because as the central government became so bloated and insulated and bureaucratic and so divorced from the will of the citizens, the citizens just started figuring out other ways to live their lives that didn't rely on the centralized government. And I think that's the lesson that we could really take from this, right? They just moved on without the government. And so in 476 AD, the very last Roman emperor, whose name ironically was the same as the very first Roman emperor, or, when it was the Roman Republic, the first leader of the Roman Republic, both of their names were Romulus. And this last final emperor really, he already had nothing to do. I mean, the Senate pretty much just did the equivalent of Trump just playing golf and going to, entertaining themselves. They really weren't like legislating. A lot of them just sort of were living in their villas along the coast or whatever. And the final general of one of these tribes, his name was Odoacer, and he showed up in the imperial palace in 476 AD. And he just strode in peacefully and stood over Romulus and informed him that he was out of a job and he was no longer necessary. And Romulus said, okay. And he left. He retired to his villa by the sea, and it was over. And I don't know if it was over like the lights just went out on the Western Roman Empire. But at that point, there were no more emperors. There was no more Senate. And yet people continued to exist, right? I think a lot of Americans fear about the decline of what we are calling Western civilization, the decline of America's chokehold on power in the world, and the decline of America as the number one greatest world power or the number one empire. I think the fear that a lot of Americans have is that it is somehow going to threaten our existence as a people or even our existence as a country. First of all, nation states have changed dozens of times, hundreds of times, maybe even more throughout history. There's no guarantee that a country is going to stay a country ever. Nation states don't have any inherent right to remain nation states. America doesn't have some sort of entitlement to remain America. Italy was divided into papal states for a couple of centuries. And before that, it was localized communities that were the remnants of the Western Roman Empire. Right? I mean, India was a whole bunch of independent kingdoms. Even what we know as Europe now was not existent in the same way before World War II and before World War I. There was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, right? There was the Prussian Empire. So borders have been drawn and redrawn over time. Governments have risen and fallen over time, and people have continued to exist, right? And I think that what determines how well those transitions happen or how badly those transitions happen really has everything to do with how adaptable people are and how willing people are to work together and function as interdependent, collaborative, cooperative societies that are willing to start organizing around new models of living when the old models of living become clearly, so deficient at serving the needs of the people that there's just no point in relying on them anymore. And it seems like Americans are finally starting, well, I don't know how many Americans, right? I mean, the internet is nothing if not a bunch of different silos into different echo chambers. So it's like you can look online across the political spectrum, across different topics, and kind of recognize trends and patterns because certainly there are real people on the internet, real people doing the commenting and the content creating. Um, how much of a representation of accurate numbers we can extrapolate from that, I don't know. How much of a representation we can extrapolate from polling, I don't know. But it is my intuitive sense that an increasing number of Americans are recognizing that the institutions that were built as what we know of to be the American government are simply failing across the board and that they are incapable of reform. And the reason they're incapable of reform is because they're not meant to be reformed. People have a very ideological view of what the America's founding fathers actually wanted for this country. And the founding myths of the American project are the source of most Americans' delusions about what this country has ever been from the beginning, and also they're kind of the source of their fantasy about a return to a better time. And I think as long as we fantasize about a return to a better time from the past, what's happening is we are losing every opportunity to build momentum in a forward direction for something that we haven't tried before. Because there really was no better time in America. If you have a clear eyed view of what the United States has really been all along, how it was founded, the total genocide of the entire native population, the constant imperialism around the world, the continued suppression of dissidents, the continued subjugation of various minority populations. There really isn't a time that the American dream has ever functioned. I think what people really hold on to is the very, very tiny recent New Deal era with Roosevelt's New Deal right after the Depression and after World War II, which really only benefited two generations, the baby boomer generation and their parents. They were the ones that capitalized on the New Deal. They were the ones that capitalized on all of the post war opportunities. And also, that was only if you were white, by the way. In order to get cheap housing, get cheap college education. That was when the middle class was able to actually grow and flourish. And by 1970, that project was already getting decimated with the advent of neoliberalism under Nixon and Henry Kissinger and they called them the Chicago Boys from the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman, Hayek, and his whole cabal, right? So that's a topic for a different time. But holding on to this ideal that we can return back to a better past is the fallacy, I think, of people at the end of all dying empires. I mean, I'm sure that the Romans were just as unaware that the empire was collapsing around them and just as sure that better times were coming if they held on long enough, right? But I want to circle back to the whole idea of does it really take a revolution? I am certain that there are probably many other examples in history that I am unaware of in which societies just moved on without their governments, especially under big empires, when the imperial government just overplayed its hand, when it started to collapse under its own hubris, when it became so divorced from the needs of the people that it refused to serve the people's collective good on any level at all, when it started to usurp all of the labor and resources and hoard all the wealth for itself, and then go off on these ridiculous, pointless military campaigns that serve no purpose other than the enrichment of a very few people at the top, right? Well, I would suspect that if we really took a look across history, that maybe the majority of the time, what happened is that people inside these empires simply moved on without their governments. And so on the left, in real leftist organizing circles, there's a principle called mutual aid, right? Um, Mutual aid is pretty much what it sounds like, where communities get together and decide what the needs of their community are, and then everybody collaborates to make sure those needs are provided for everyone. Um, there are, all sorts of local economies that can get formed. People can engage in barter. People can engage in trade. People can support local farms, community gardens, alternative housing projects such as tiny home communities, earthship communities. Like there's one out in Taos, New Mexico called the Earthship Village, right? Which is a totally off grid community. And for years and years and years, I dismissed the value of uh, doing things locally because it just never seemed big enough. It always seemed like just putting a drop of water into an ocean of dysfunction. And that was part of the reason I hung all my hopes and dreams upon the Bernie Sanders presidency, because I felt very convinced that without somebody in the top position of power who was able to galvanize these millions of supporters at the grassroots, there just wouldn't be the mechanisms for affecting social change that we really need, because the rest of the government was going to continue to operate in the way that it always does. And I don't know that I've necessarily concluded that that's wrong. I think that it certainly presented a major advantage, and that the opportunity cost that Americans caused for themselves by not holding the Democratic Party accountable, by not fighting to get Bernie to run as an independent, I really think that those opportunity costs have been catastrophic for us all. Um, but we can't go back to those times, right? So, what is possible is for us to just simply render the government irrelevant. That's the thought that I want to leave everybody with. How do we make this government irrelevant? How do we just stop relying on them, right? What can we do to support ourselves and each other so that we and everybody in our communities have our needs met? Everybody needs to be fed, everybody needs to be housed, everybody needs modern utilities, all that kind of stuff, right? And I think that it is exponentially more difficult under late stage capitalism, where we have such a heavy reliance on centralized utility systems, on technology, when we have this AI driven mass surveillance dragnet dropping down on us very quickly, and where multiple states are extremely hostile to off grid community projects. I know in Florida, if you have a food forest in your yard, if you have a food garden in your yard as a homeowner, or if you start collecting rainwater, they will send fucking SWAT teams to your house to shut it all down. So it's going to take an increased amount of creativity and solidarity and social cohesion and organization. But I do think it's possible. And I think that it is a far more constructive way of dealing with our current reality as the Epstein class and its empire government continues to collapse under its own hubris. Because what the oligarchs want to do is they absolutely want to take us down with them, right? I mean, the increase among the billionaire class in building underground bunkers, um, buying up militarized security troops and tanks. These purchases have only increased exponentially in the past 10 years, right? And then we have like some of the Silicon Valley tech billionaires' obsession with moving to space, Elon Musk wanting to move to space. They all know what's coming, and they all know that they caused it. Like, these are the people that caused all of the problems on Earth. And what they want to do is they want to continue to cannibalize all the wealth and resources here until the last possible second, and then make their exit and leave everybody else to go down with the ship, right? To suffer under the mess. That's the reality of it. And so they've known that the pitchforks are coming. And I think that one of two things is the likely outcome. I think there is either an inevitable revolt, um, which could go in a whole lot of directions. And unfortunately, historically, spontaneous revolutions don't tend to go well in terms of what happens next, because spontaneous revolutions that are not well organized, that are not well thought out, where there's no cohesive plan for what you do after you overthrow the existing system, tend to create a power vacuum. And the level of instability and insecurity that people feel causes the most of the public to start calling for a strongman to come in and save them. And that's how you end up with an even more totalitarian type of system um, afterwards. Unfortunately, that is sort of the way that the Russian Revolution and the French revolutions went. So revolutionary movements have to have a lot of discipline. They have to be extremely well organized. They have to have a lot of infrastructure that is very thoroughly built out in advance. And the best examples that we have of these things still did not achieve their objectives. So I would say the best examples that we have had of these in recent years was the Occupy Wall Street and the Occupy movement, which managed to sustain itself for months. We had the Freedom Convoy in Canada with the trucker convoy. They managed to shut down much of Canada's economy. They shut down the entire capital. They shut down a bunch of bridges and ports for months. And we also had something that a lot of people are unaware of, which was the teachers' strikes in 2017 and 2018 that began in West Virginia and spread to multiple different states. And that actually is a really good, interesting model of how to affect social change the right way, in the effective way. If you want to learn how those teacher strikes played out, I would actually recommend Michael Moore's film, Fahrenheit 11/9. And nobody seems to have heard of that film. Everybody knows Fahrenheit 9/11. We all know that one. But he put out a film in 2017 or 2018 called Fahrenheit 11/9. And the premise of the film was to show how Trump got elected the first time and to kind of debunk a lot of the mythology around why and how Trump got elected. But a central feature of that film was following the trajectory of the West Virginia teacher strikes. And when you look at how they built these movements, and by the way, teachers in across the entire state of West Virginia and then multiple other states where these strikes caught on, managed to get all of their agenda implemented. By the way, these were very, very successful movements. And then on a smaller scale, Shama Sawant's success as the openly independent socialist city commissioner of Seattle for 6 years is another really good model. There's a website called Popular Resistance. I think it's .org. But Popular Resistance tracks social movements and political movements all over the world. They have a very robust database of source material on where things were successful, where they were not, why they did not succeed if they didn't. And they have a free 8-module school on their website about effective social organizing. But the crux of effective social organizing is, in the end, local social cohesion and mutual aid, because as human beings, we have real needs that have to be met. This is why you can't just have a revolt in a day or a week, right? And have people leave their housing and start doing bill strikes and refusing to pay taxes and stuff like that individually. Because every time people take these actions individually, you're going to get crushed by the systemic forces that are keeping these structures in place. This is why collective action is required. And I sound like I have gone straight into the opposite premise of this video and started promoting, revolution and activism again. But I don't think I am, because I don't know how different these two things are once the tires actually hit the road and you put the successful, effective strategies to work, right? The strategies that have been shown to work historically, ultimately, they're based around parallel economies, parallel societies at the local level. And I think that, I know for me, this still can feel really overwhelming. I am not well enough resourced to be the head of any type of social movement or start any organizations or start any nonprofits or do any of these things. And honestly, I expended so much energy into this over the last 20 years that I am supportive of other people doing this stuff and would be happy to join and support where I can. But for me to put the time and energy into moving forward a project like that would be to my own detriment, the detriment of my own material well-being and mental well-being. So it's just not something that I am equipped to do. But I take hope in the fact that I think there is a path through where we are that is not a revolution, that is not a violent revolution. And I also think that we do have interesting times upon us as far as the cyclical nature of human evolution, which I just saw how long this video has gone, and I haven't talked about. I haven't gotten into the thing that I really wanted to get into, which was the cyclical nature of human evolution according to the cosmology of every ancient civilization here on planet Earth, right? So let me see how I can break this down succinctly, and then I'll throw out some resources for anybody that wants to look into this further. But we are taught in school and in science classes, and, I don't think anybody gets archaeology classes in school unless they study it in college. But we're taught that humanity evolved in a linear fashion, right? That humans evolved on Earth a couple 100,000 years ago, and we were all these kinds of prehistoric things. Like first we were apes, and then there were like Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons and whatever that, Homo erectus, whatever that trajectory was that we see in the little evolution cartoons. And that this is the most evolved that humanity has ever been, because as time has gone on, humanity has continued to get smarter and outpace the humanity of the past and the human societies of the past. And I think this is a fundamental cognitive distortion that a lot of people hold when they idealize these mass scale societies with these huge nation states like the United States, these bloated national governments and these empires that are all based on a increasingly unsustainable, unworkable capitalist economic hegemon, right? Is people tend to think, well, this is the best we've ever had, therefore it's the best we can ever get. And history, I think, disproves the idea that humanity has evolved in a linear fashion. And if you take a look at the cosmology of the most ancient civilizations here on this earth, in fact, especially the Indus River Valley civilization of India, the Vedic societies of India, the Sumerians, the Mesopotamians, the Mayans, all of them tracked their cosmology in terms of a cycle, right? In terms of a wheel. And they clocked this according to the precession of the equinoxes, right? Earth's natural tilt toward and away from the sun, which happens in very large cycles of just under 26,000 years and kind of subcycles of around 13,000 years, right? And they pretty much unilaterally found that when Earth is closest to the sun, human societies are much more illuminated, much more enlightened, and much more advanced. And when Earth tilts further away from the sun, we tend to get plunged into a dark age. And this cosmology varies from civilization to civilization. There are some finer differences between them. But this was the source of all the misunderstandings people had around what they thought was the Mayan calendar. They thought that the Mayan calendar ends in 2012 and that the Mayans said that the world ends in 2012. That's not actually what the Mayans said at all. I have a quick story time about this. I was in Mexico in 2005 with a group of Americans from a herbal holistic healing school that had built a relationship with a Mayan shaman. He was like a 30th generation shaman. I don't, however many generations go back to when the actual Mayans were an empire, right? Like an unbroken lineage of shamans. And we were traveling through Mexico in the Yucatan with this guy. His name was Hunbat's Men. He died a few years back. And we were visiting all these ancient Mayan sites, and he was teaching us about the Mayan cosmology, the science behind them, the astronomy, the astrology, all that kind of stuff. And I had the opportunity to have a private one-to-one conversation with him about the Mayan calendar, and he took a tree stump and he explained the whole thing to me with a tree stump and a stick, and the wheel of 25,800 years that is broken into halves of whatever half of that is, 13 something thousand years, right? And that there are four, cycles that go from an age of enlightenment and illumination, and then they kind of degenerate to a dark age, and then there's a reset, and then the cycle restarts again on the other side. And so 2012, according to the Mayan calendar, was the end of the dark age, but it was the beginning of the end of the dark age, right? Like even in the Indian cosmology, these dark ages, it's not like the Roman Empire, the way that we think of that, where it just ends with the flip of a switch, right? In Sanskrit, in the Vedic cosmology, they say that there is a yuga sandhi. So yuga is the Sanskrit word for the age, and then the sandhi is the overlap where one age is ending and then the other age is beginning, right? They start to dovetail together. And according to the Vedic cosmology, that points to these same cycles, the Yuga Sandhi can sometimes, be anywhere between a couple hundred years. So the Mayans were saying the same thing. So that's what that was about. Where this ties interestingly into the cabal of unelected powers, the banking cartels, the oligarchs, the billionaire class, and all of the things that they have increasingly done to implement total social control, including they want to control our minds. Like they want to actually control all of our thoughts, all of our feelings, our emotions, our beliefs, everything, right? They want absolute total enslavement of the general population. And that's what they have been trying to implement repeatedly. You can research this yourself, draw your own conclusions, but there was a CIA project that was in coordination with secret military projects called Stargate, which was allegedly a portal that they were able to create where they could view into the future, right? Well, actually view into the past and view into the future. There is a similar thing allegedly held by the Vatican called a chronovisor. And then also, this is provable as well. The CIA put hundreds of billions of dollars into trying to create psychic soldiers and develop people's psychic abilities, including a project called remote viewing. Right. And so there's this project of teaching people how to remote view across time and space. There are contested conclusions about the results. Some people say that the most effective results the CIA was ever managed to muster was like something like 47% accuracy. But that's just a combination of Stargate and chronovisor. The lore around this, and I think this is just as plausible as any other theory. I am inclined to say that it's true because it tracks with the pattern of behavior of this class of people. The lore around this is that They were able to predict everything in the future up until 2012, and then they have been unable to see what happens after 2012 at all, which sent the ruling classes into a panic because all of the ancient cosmology, which the ruling classes, as we all know, are part of these various dark cults and secret societies, whether or not we believe in astronomy and astrology and cosmology, they very much believe in this shit, numerology, all the things. And from all these ancient mystery schools, like they're very big devotees of this kind of stuff. Um, when they could not see past 2012 and they referenced all of the ancient wisdom traditions and cosmologies of every ancient civilization on earth, predicting that there was a reset, an end of a dark age on earth, resetting to an age of enlightenment, resetting to a golden age, um, or at least an upswing, depending on who you talk to, into a better age than the one that we're in. Um, the start of that trajectory was in 2012, right? Like 2012 marked the ending of that. And interestingly enough, that is also when CERN in Switzerland turned on the Large Hadron Collider for the first time. And there are a whole lot of theories about what CERN really does. But considering the fact that they are fucking with space time and fucking with what they found, the Higgs boson particle, right? What they call the God particle, like from which all matter is based. They have this giant machine in Switzerland just crashing these particles together to see what happens. And there's a lot of credible theories that they've been messing with space time. And, people across the world that have been paying attention seem to notice that there is some correlation between all of these various Mandela effects and the bringing of the Large Hadron Collider online. So you could plausibly extrapolate that the ruling classes saw that there was an inevitable future in which they are no longer in power because humanity simply rises above them. Like the actual electromagnetic and energetic frequency of Earth and the human collective ascends to a frequency band where they are no longer able to exist or maintain control. And that is why they have accelerated all of their attempts to try and keep us on this old timeline and enslave us further, including the transhumanist movement with all of these, World Economic Forum people and these Silicon Valley people wanting to make us biologically dependent on their technology, right? Not just dependent like using the internet all the time, but sticking chips in us and the whole transhumanism thing. So circling back to this ancient cosmology, there are multiple scriptures in the Vedas, multiple bodies of work. I don't want to overwhelm you with detail about the different types of Vedic scriptures, but there is a set of scriptures called the Puranas, which is the various tales of the play of consciousness interacting with itself in multiple different forms, like all the different gods and goddesses and their Leela, their play on earth, the battles they fought, all that kind of stuff. The Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the stories of Krishna, Rama, all these things exist in the Puranas. But there is a lot of really deep mathematical calculation in the Puranas about the movement of existence from form into formless, right? So in the Vedic cosmology, consciousness is one, right? Existence is one. It is the ground of being, right? We are everything that you can see and name and sense with the five senses, your existence down to the smallest neutrino, atom and particle exists because of consciousness. Consciousness is non-local. It's not something that happens because there's a brain, right? You don't need a brain. You don't need the ability to think to have consciousness. You don't need memory. Consciousness is not a function. It is the thing in which everything else arises and appears in the simulation, right? Or the Maya, the illusion. And it's not an illusion like it's unreal. Like your power bill's real, your rent is real, the pain in your body is real, but it is an apparent reality that is dependent upon consciousness itself, because without consciousness, none of this would be able to exist, right? So, um, existence kind of breathes, inhales and exhales in and out of form on these long cycles of millions of years, right? What the Vedas call Brahman, which is kind of like the ultimate source of all things, the ultimate God, is consciousness itself, which is existence itself. And in millions and millions of years, Brahman goes to sleep. And when Brahman is sleeping, everything is formless. So everything in existence, the entire cosmos, planet Earth, everything, for every other planet, every other galaxy, solar system, all of it is withdrawn, like the way a spider withdraws its web, right? Like a spider spins its web, and then if you scare the spider, it kind of just goes whoop up the thread, right? Brahman goes to sleep. All of this is withdrawn, which is called the pralaya, the end of all existence. Everything is withdrawn back into the body of Brahman. And then millions of years later, Brahman wakes up. And when Brahman wakes up, Brahman becomes aware of itself as existence. And in that awareness of itself as existence, existence wants to know itself. And in order to know itself, there has to be duality. There has to be two, right? Because everything, the ability to know anything is relative. You can only know cold because you know hot. You can only know love because you know hate, right? True, false, all that kind of stuff. And so with the awakening of Brahman becomes the beginnings again of duality. And with the beginnings again of duality, there becomes a self and an other. And so that is how creation comes into being, including planet Earth, right? So then all of this creation persists in these big long cycles of millions of years, and then there are subcycles of hundreds of thousands of years, and then there are subcycles within those of tens of thousands of years, and then subcycles within those, right? And so what the cosmology points to is that the humanity's dark age has been going on for a couple thousand years, and it is actually coming to an end now. And depending on how you interpret the cosmology, there is one school of thought that is promoted by he was a guy from the 1800s named Sri Yukteswar, and he wrote a book originally about this called The Holy Science. You can check that out. It's called The Holy Science. There are whole websites based on the four yugas, based on his work. His name was Sri Yukteswar. And then a more recent scholar named Bibhu Dev Mishra wrote a book called The Yuga Shift. And Bibhu Dev Mishra's work was even more interesting because he compared all of the Vedic cosmology with every other ancient system of cosmology in the world. So he connected the threads between the Mayan system, the Sumerians, everybody else. He went back, he redid the math from the beginning. And based on these two scholars, their thinking is that you have the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Truth, which is Satya Yuga, which goes for about 5,600 years. And then it devolves into something called Treta Yuga, which is the first introduction of falsehood into humanity, right? And then Treta Yuga persists for, I think, 4,000 or something years. It's a ratio of like 4, 3, 2, 1. So the four yugas are not evenly split into the same amount of time, right? Treta Yuga means 3. So the way that this is explained in the Vedic cosmology is that the age of truth is 4 legs of the bull, all standing on 4 legs of the bull. So the 4 legs of the bull are truth, compassion, righteousness as a society, and awareness of the true self as consciousness. And then with each one of these ages, 1 leg of the bull is kicked out from under it, until you get to the dark age where the bull is only standing on 1 leg. So Treta Yuga is 3 legs of the bull. It's the first introduction of falsehood and deception. That goes on for quite a while. And then there's a descension into Dwapara Yuga. Dwapara means 2, right? Where there's only 2 legs left. things start to look more dicey. Humanity is still able to ascend to a more enlightened form on an individual level, but it gets harder. And then it descends to Kali Yuga, which lasts for a couple thousand years, which is the ultimate dark age. The bull is standing on only one leg, and it is nearly impossible even for the individual to be able to liberate itself from the simulation. I mean, it can be done, but it is much, much harder and almost impossible for the collective society to do so, because the structures controlling society at that point have become so corrupt, so devoid of any dharma, any righteousness, any altruism, that it's all a shit show from there, right? So, according to Yukteswar and Vibhudev Mishra, the way that they interpret the cosmology is Kali Yuga ends, there's the Yuga Sandhi of a couple hundred years, and then things go on a gradual upswing back on the other side of the wheel. So, like 13,000 years down, 13,000 years up, right? And so now from Kali Yuga, you ascend into Dvapara Yuga, and then you ascend into Treta Yuga, and then you ascend to Satya Yuga, right? So, it's much more gradual. But in the Puranas, in another body of scriptures, where there is kind of like a majority of the opinions that have been collected across time about this, the way that it is looked at is that Kali Yuga comes to an end kind of with a bang. There's like a whole lot of chaos and apocalyptic disruption, and then there is a reset, and that reset triggers a golden age into another age of truth or another Satya Yuga, right? That's actually the origin of the kind of apocalypse mythology of the Abrahamic religions, their beliefs in like the book of Revelations and the rapture. All of this really comes from this deeper cosmology, distortions of it, right? Misinterpretations of it. And the Mayans had similar interpretation that the dark age comes to an end, there's a reset, and then there's a new golden age. The Sumerians also kind of said the same thing. So all these different, cosmological interpretations converge upon the time that we're living in right now, which is what is really interesting, because you have these disparate wisdom traditions, these disparate mystery schools from across the world, various forms of astrology, various forms of even astronomy, cosmology. There's a geophysicist named Stefan Burns who's even talked about this based on tracking the space weather in our solar system, the solar cycles, the electromagnetic changes on planet Earth, the movement of the poles, the equinoxes, and so forth. All of these disparate traditions from across the world, without having, decided to have a discussion together and come up with a mutual set of conclusions, has all been converging upon the conclusion that we are in an ascension on planet Earth now, that there is a mass awakening happening on planet Earth that isn't just happening on an individual level, although the individual level is important, right? The more you awaken, the more I awaken, the more we also help to awaken the planet, because we are all interconnected. But that the planet herself, the planet's electromagnetic field, the activity of the sun, the precession of the equinoxes, the cycle of the ages is all converging upon an awakening, right? And that is theoretically what the cabal of oligarchs and ruling elites also became aware of when they were, through Project Stargate and the Chronovisor and whatever, when they were trying to look into the future. So, where I want to land on this is that taking this to be true and fitting it into the context of the way the Roman Empire ended, the way that I think a lot of human societies have transitioned from empires into normal countries, and the possible larger shifts on the planet, I think that I think it's possible to catch the wave, right? Like, I'm thinking of Finding Nemo, um, the little kids cartoon, when they're all searching for Nemo, and and they hit the Gulf Stream, right? And the turtles that just kind of float along in the Gulf Stream are like, just catch the current and go with the flow, right? I think that the current on Earth is a current towards a mass awakening. I think it is a current towards the collective demand for a kinder society, a kinder world, a world that works for everybody, a multipolar world that is not dictated by singular imperial powers or bodies of rich people who seek to exploit and oppress everybody else. I think it's pretty obvious that the world's governments are opposed to this movement, and that the body politic, the civilian populations of the world want one thing, and the governments of the world want something that is completely opposite, and they're forming this inherent tension. But if you think about how frequency works, like, even, I don't know who's ever listened to the radio in the last 20 years, but think about how radio waves work or TV stations work, right? If you want to listen to salsa and merengue all the time on 89.9 FM, you have to tune your radio to 89.9 FM. But if you switch the dial to a different frequency, the the waves that are carrying salsa and merengue haven't disappeared, right? You are just not getting salsa and merengue because you changed to a different frequency band. And the fact that Earth, well, I can we establish this as fact? I don't know. I'm inclined to think it is fact, right? I can only say that intuitively and based on pattern recognition and my own, individual study, inward reflection and study of these various traditions. I think it is fact. You have to draw your own conclusions. But if one were to take it as fact that Earth is in an ascension, that humanity is going through a mass awakening, and that the old Western empires that seek to colonize and exploit the global South and implement worse and worse measures of social control on their own populations in order to get away with it and immiserate us all, um, are losing power, and that's why they're becoming so increasingly aggressive with everything. If we take that stuff as fact, um, I think the theory that there are multiple timelines on Earth and that those timelines are splitting based on frequency is pretty plausible. And according to that school of thought, how what determines which timeline you end up on is determined by your own individual frequency. Which frequency, which energy you align with, and which vision of Earth you align yourself with. And I think a powerful way to align ourselves with a higher ascension timeline is to invest in the model of creating parallel societies, parallel economies, and nurturing each other at the local level, nurturing ourselves, investing in our own awakening, and simply rendering these old structures obsolete by withdrawing our consent from them and taking back our sovereignty. And taking back our sovereignty has to happen internally before it can really manifest itself externally. So that is what I want to leave you guys to ponder today. And if you would like to support this channel or my work, I would actually be very grateful. I am certainly in need of survival income at this time. I can drop my PayPal and my Cash App in the video's description. I appreciate anybody who happened to listen to this video. I hope you derived something out of it. I hope you got some hope from it. I hope maybe it helped to expand your thinking a little bit in the way that this has expanded my thinking. And I really appreciate you being here. So bye for now.